We were going to take a question at this point from Nat Lewin. He wants to, he has a response for Mark.
What? We should keep you behind your pillar.
I asked, after reading Mark, who is an old and dear friend and one who I think does belong in the category of academic writers about religion clause, but after reading his paper last night, I asked for the opportunity to respond right after he spoke today, because I think the paper, I mean, frankly, it angered me.
Then I did.
But I think, what?
And I did a good job.
Well, maybe so. I don't know. It angered me. Let me say first, even as a matter of personal privilege, I mean, a paper that purports to speak of the rise and fall of Jewish interest in religion clause litigation and discusses what organizations, Jewish organizations, have done in the Supreme Court, and has not a single mention of the National Jewish Commission on Law and Public Affairs, which I have to say has written, I think, 31 briefs in religion cases in the Supreme Court, 30 of which I wrote, and the first of which was written when I was still with the government and could not write briefs on behalf of private organizations. And the paper not only doesn't talk about the positions that were presented to the Supreme Court by a unified Orthodox community in these 31 cases, but doesn't even mention the Jewish cases that appeared before the Supreme Court, whether it was the Yarmulke case, Goldman and Weinberger, whether it was the menorah in front of Pittsburgh City Hall, ACLU in Allegheny County, whether it was Kiryas Joel, whether it was even the United Jewish Organizations of Williamsburg. I mean, I did not understand how somebody could write a paper that would talk about Jewish interest in religion clause litigation and just totally ignore what was presented, maybe by a community that the American Jewish Congress doesn't care for, maybe by a community that the American Jewish Congress consistently opposes and takes contrary positions to, but nonetheless, issues that have been presented to the Supreme Court. But what angered me about the paper, besides the questions of personal privilege, was the fact that the paper and Mark today speaks of the fact that there's this, phenomenal success, Jewish success in terms of litigation by Leo Pfeffer before the Supreme. When I think, and I think there's a substantial part of the Jewish community that's coming to the view, and I even hear stirrings of it from Mark Stern up here at this podium, that say, well, maybe what Leo Pfeffer did in the Supreme Court of the United States, in very fertile ground before a Supreme Court that had Warren, Brennan, Black, Douglas, Goldberg, people who were ready to take this absolute view that the harm that that Supreme Court did in terms of the future of Jewish identity in the United States was lasting and very, very damaging. I think Leo Pfeffer did an enormous disservice to the Jewish community in the United States by the positions that the American Jewish Congress took, many of which, by the way, have been repudiated and overruled by subsequent Supreme Courts. I mean, the Mishigas that says that a public school teacher, when he goes in to a parochial school, into a Catholic school, or into a Jewish, into a yeshiva, is violating some constitutional right when it's a secular teacher teaching handicapped children within the walls of a yeshiva. I mean, that's crazy. It's really crazy. And yet, Leo Pfeffer and the American Jewish Congress persuaded the Supreme Court for a while that it was unconstitutional to allow that. Mark says religious liberty, the free exercise clause, is the stepchild and has been, unfortunately, ignored. Well, look, if you look at his paper, you'll see there was a key turning point. In 1972, I drafted and Congress enacted a provision in the Civil Rights Act that said that private employers had to accommodate to the religious observance of their employees, reasonable accommodation unless there was undue hardship. A case comes up in the Supreme Court called Hardison versus TWA. The Orthodox community, and I argued that as an amicus in the Supreme Court, said, hey, religion is in the Constitution. It's an important right. It takes precedence over seniority rights. Leo Pfeffer writes a brief that does not support that position. He says, oh, in an abstract sense, maybe, yeah, you should be able to protect religious accommodation. Mark says in his paper, the Orthodox community went too far by supporting the notion of religious accommodation. And the Supreme Court holds that seniority rights take precedence over religious accommodation. That was a disaster. It was a disaster which Mark is now trying to overcome with new amendments to federal statutes that would say that you have to engage in religious accommodation. The fact is that during all those years, the American Jewish Congress, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, these organizations were acting, I think, contrary to Jewish interests in the United States. And I think they continue to do that. We had a big argument last night with Alan Dershowitz, and I continue to have it with Mark, over menorahs in public places, over those kinds of issues. For Jews, for a group of rabbis to write letters to local communities saying, take down the menorah, take down the menorah. That's what's happened. That happened last year in Connecticut. I think that's a nice Jewish word, a shanda. And I put to you that it is the history of what Mark glowingly describes in this paper that is today, the consequences of it are being reaped today by the Jewish community.
I take it you don't agree.